There is a story running inside you right now. You did not write it consciously. You did not sit down one quiet morning and decide, this is who I am, this is what I deserve, this is how far I am allowed to go. No one does that. And yet, somehow, the story is there, fully formed, deeply lodged, playing on a loop so constant, so familiar, that you stopped hearing it years ago. It sounds like I am not the kind of person who finishes things. It sounds like people like me do not get to have that. It sounds like I will start when I am ready, when things calm down, when I feel more like myself. But here is what no one tells you. The waiting is part of the story too. You have been the most loyal reader of a narrative that was never actually true. A story assembled from the fears of people who loved you imperfectly, from the wounds that never fully closed, from the versions of yourself you tried on and abandoned, not because they did not fit, but because someone told you they were too much, too bold, too different from what the people around you were comfortable with. And so you made yourself smaller. You edited yourself down into something manageable, something recognizable, something safe. And you called that yourself. This is not a self-help program. This is not a list of habits to adopt by Tuesday. This is not a motivational speech dressed in calm language. What you are about to enter is something far quieter and far more permanent than any of those things. Over the next 90 days, something will shift inside you. Not because you will push harder, not because you will finally find the discipline you have been chasing, but because you are going to do the one thing the old story has always been afraid of. You are going to stop believing it. 90 days. Not a lifetime. Not a year. 90 days of deliberate, quiet, deeply intentional rewriting. The ancient Stoics understood something that modern self-improvement culture has entirely forgotten. Change is not a performance. It is not a transformation you announce to the people in your life. It is a private act of profound courage, the kind that happens in the space between one thought and the next. In the moment you choose, silently and without applause, to respond to your life differently than you did yesterday. Marcus Aurelius wrote these words alone, in a journal he never intended for the world to read. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He was not writing a slogan. He was writing a survival manual for a man who ruled an empire and still felt the weight of his own untamed mind every single morning. If a Roman emperor needed 90 days of daily philosophical practice to remember who he was, what makes you think you are the exception? You are not here by accident. Something brought you to this moment. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the quiet terror of looking up one day and realizing that another year has passed and you still feel like a rough draft of the person you were meant to become. Whatever it was, that feeling is not weakness. That feeling is the story cracking open. And this, right now, in this stillness, is where the rewriting begins. Chapter 1. The story that was never yours first, say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. These words belong to Epictetus, a man who was born with nothing, owned nothing, and yet understood something about human identity that most people with every advantage in the world never grasp. Think back, not to last year, not to last month, but to the very first time someone told you who you were. Perhaps it was a teacher who handed back a piece of work and said with tired certainty that you were not the academic type. Perhaps it was a parent, not cruel, not intentionally unkind, who simply worried aloud so often and so consistently that their worry became your blueprint. Perhaps it was a friend, a sibling, a passing comment from someone whose name you can barely remember now, that landed in the soft soil of your young mind and took root before you had any means to question it. You did not choose that route. You were not consulted. And yet here you are, decades later, still growing in the direction that route decided for you. This is what psychologists call the narrative self. The ongoing story a person constructs about who they are, where they came from, and what kind of future is available to them. Researchers have found that the stories people tell about themselves are among the most powerful predictors of their behavior, their resilience, and even their physical health. We do not simply have stories. We become them. But here is the critical distinction that most people miss entirely. The narrative self is not fixed. It is not biological. It is not written into your bones. It is a living document, and like any document, it can be revised, restructured, and ultimately rewritten from the ground up. Epictetus, born into slavery, denied every external freedom a human being can be denied, understood this more deeply than perhaps any philosopher who ever lived. He taught that the only true freedom any person possesses is the freedom of their own judgment, the freedom to decide what a thing means, the freedom to look at the story you have inherited and say, quietly but absolutely, this does not belong to me. Consider for a moment the stories you carry right now, not the grand narratives, not I am a failure or I am unlovable, but the small, quiet, everyday ones, the ones that whisper rather than shout. I am not good with money. I always give up before the end. I need to know someone is proud of me before I can feel proud of myself. I work best under pressure, which is why I always wait until the last moment. These are not personality traits. They are not facts about you. They are stories. Inherited, absorbed, repeated so many thousands of times that they calcified into what felt like permanent truth. The Stoics had a practice called prasoche, the art of self-attention. Not self-criticism, not self-judgment. Simply the sustained, honest, quiet act of watching your own mind as it moves through the day, noticing which thoughts you reach for automatically, noticing which stories activate without your permission, noticing with compassion rather than contempt how much of what you call instinct is actually just memory. The first act of your 90 days is not a new habit. It is not a morning routine or a journaling practice or a cold shower. The first act, the one that makes everything else possible, is simply this. Acknowledge that the story you have been living was never entirely yours to begin with. You absorbed it. You were shaped by it. You have defended it, performed it, and sometimes even suffered for it. But you did not choose it. And anything you did not consciously choose, you have the absolute authority to consciously release. This is not about blame. There is no value in tracing every thread of the old story back to its origin and standing in judgment over the people who handed it to you. Most of them were simply passing on the stories that had been handed to them. The chain of inherited narratives runs back further than any of us can trace. What matters is not where the story came from. What matters is what you do with it now that you can see it clearly. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." The story that has been blocking you is not your enemy. It is your material. It is the very thing you are going to work with over these 90 days, not to destroy it, not to pretend it never existed, but to understand it so thoroughly that it loses every ounce of power it ever held over you. You were handed a story. Now, for the first time, you are going to choose your own. Chapter 2. The 90-day threshold, why this number changes everything. We have always looked for the right moment to begin. Not the moment when we are ready, because we suspect that moment may never arrive, but the moment when beginning feels safe enough, when the risk feels small enough, when the gap between who we are and who we want to become feels narrow enough to cross without losing too much of ourselves in the attempt. That moment, as you may have noticed, tends not to come, and so we wait. Another month, another season, another year that begins with resolution and ends with the quiet guilt of yet another unfinished beginning. 90 days changes this. Not because it is magic, not because neuroscience has found some precise biological reset that happens on the 91st morning, but because 90 days is long enough to be real and short enough to feel possible. It sits at a precise intersection that most people never find, because they are always reaching for either too little time or too much. 2 weeks is not enough. 2 weeks is a sprint, and sprints produce performance, not transformation. You can sustain almost anything for 2 weeks. You can white-knuckle your way through 2 weeks of almost any behavior change and feel briefly victorious before the old patterns flood back the moment the pressure lifts. A year is too much. A year is so vast that your future self absorbs all the responsibility and your present self remains entirely comfortable. I will deal with that in the new year. I will start properly in the spring. The distance of a full year gives the old story infinite room to breathe. 90 days gives it none. 90 days sits close enough that you can feel its edge. You can sense the shape of day 91 from where you are standing right now. It is not abstract. It is not theoretical. It is a real, bounded container of time. And within that container, a new story can take its first genuinely stable roots. The neuroscience here is significant. The brain does not change through intention. It changes through repetition, through the slow, unglamorous daily act of choosing differently, often in the face of every internal signal telling you to revert. Neuroplasticity. The brain's extraordinary capacity to form new neural pathways is not activated by insight. It is activated by practice. By the accumulation of small, consistent, deliberate choices made across enough days that the new pathway begins to feel more natural than the old one. 90 days of daily practice is approximately the minimum threshold at which genuine neural restructuring begins to feel like identity rather than effort. Epictetus said, "First learn the meaning of what you say, and then speak." Before you can speak a new story, you must first live it long enough to understand what it means in the body, not just in the mind. You must feel what it feels like to choose patience when you would have chosen reactivity, to choose stillness when you would have chosen noise, to choose forward when every familiar instinct is telling you to stop. That feeling, accumulated across 90 mornings, is what eventually becomes who you are. Marcus Aurelius did not write his private philosophical journals for a single week and then consider himself transformed. He returned to the same questions, the same disciplines, the same practices across years of daily writing. What we know as meditations is not a finished work. It is a record of a man in constant patient, daily practice of becoming the person his values demanded. That is what 90 days asks of you. Not perfection. Not dramatic visible change by day 30. Not the transformation that looks compelling in a photograph. Just the quiet, daily, non-negotiable act of choosing the new story over the old one, even when the old one is louder, more familiar, and significantly more comfortable. There will be days in your 90 where you will not feel it. Days where the old story surges back with a confidence that makes you question whether any of this is real. Those days are not signs that you are failing. Those days are signs that the old story is losing its grip and making noise about it. Stay. The threshold is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. On day 90, you will not wake to trumpets or a sudden overwhelming certainty that you have arrived. What you will find, if you have truly committed to the practice, is something quieter and infinitely more durable than certainty. You will find that the new story has started to feel like home. Chapter 3. The lies we call personality. At some point in your life, someone asked you what you were like, and you answered without hesitation. I am an introvert. I am impatient. I am not a morning person. I am terrible at confrontation. I am the kind of person who feels things too deeply. I am someone who needs a lot of time alone. I am not naturally disciplined. You said these things as though you were reading from a document that had been signed and notarized at birth. As though personality were a fixed inheritance, passed down like eye color or bone structure, immovable and final. But what if none of that is true? What if what you call your personality is simply the set of responses that worked well enough, for long enough, in the specific environment you grew up in? Introversion that was actually a learned response to an environment where being visible felt dangerous. Impatience that was trained into you by years of watching the adults around you react to frustration with urgency and noise. The inability to handle confrontation that was not a personality trait, but a survival strategy developed in a home where conflict had unpredictable consequences. What if the label was never the truth of you? What if the label was simply the story that made the most sense of an experience you were too young to fully understand? Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." And perhaps nowhere is this more painfully true than in the stories we tell ourselves about our own fixed nature. The suffering of believing you cannot change is not located in reality. It is located entirely in the story. The story that says this is simply who I am, and who I am is not enough, and who I am cannot be different, so there is no point in trying. That story is the most expensive lie you have ever told yourself. Modern psychology has spent decades dismantling the myth of fixed personality. Research on growth mindset, replicated across hundreds of studies in multiple cultures, consistently demonstrates that people who believe their qualities are changeable do change them. Not through wishful thinking, not through affirmations spoken into a mirror, but through the sustained, deliberate practice of behaving as though the new story were already true. This is the practice the Stoics called acting in accordance with reason. Choosing to behave in alignment with your highest values rather than your most deeply ingrained patterns, not because the patterns are not real, but because they are not the final word on who you are capable of becoming. Your personality is not your destiny. It is your current default setting. And defaults, as anyone who has ever changed the settings on any device knows, can always be changed. The question your 90 days is asking is not, "Who am I?" That question keeps you anchored to the old story, constantly referencing the past to define the present. The question your 90 days is asking is something far more powerful. Who am I choosing to be? That single shift from identity as inheritance to identity as active choice is the philosophical foundation upon which every other change in this journey is built. Without it, every new habit is a performance. Every discipline is forced. Every morning routine is a costume worn over the same unchanged self. With it, everything becomes different. Not easier necessarily, but real. Grounded in something deeper than motivation, which fades, deeper than inspiration, which is inconsistent, deeper even than willpower, which is finite. Grounded in the quiet, radical, daily decision to be the author rather than the character. This is the third truth of your 90 days. Your personality is a story, and you are not obligated to keep telling it. Chapter 4. Silence as the first act of rewriting. Before you can write something new, you have to stop filling the page with old ink. This is a truth that the modern world has made almost impossibly difficult to live by. We are surrounded at every waking hour by noise. Not just the literal noise of notifications and conversations and content streaming from every available screen, but the deeper noise. The constant low-grade hum of other people's opinions about who you should be, what you should want, how fast you should be moving, and how much further along you should already be. Silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is the deliberate withdrawal of your attention from the voices that are not yours. The Stoics practiced what they called the retreat into the self. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it with a longing that feels remarkably modern. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. And so he should use that retirement constantly. This was a man surrounded by the noise of empire, of war, of political intrigue, of the endless demands that come with being the most powerful person in the known world. And his prescription for sanity, for clarity, for the ability to keep choosing wisely in the middle of all of that, was not a longer strategy session. It was not a more detailed plan. It was silence, the deliberate daily practice of returning to the interior. What does silence look like in practice during your 90 days? It looks like choosing, at least once a day, to be somewhere that is not being narrated to you. No podcast playing while you walk. No music filling the space while you cook. No background television providing the illusion of company while you eat. Just you and the quiet. And whatever rises to the surface when the noise stops. What rises will not always be comfortable. In the early days of silence, what tends to surface first is the backlog, all the thoughts and feelings and half-formed fears that the noise was keeping just below the level of consciousness. This is why most people cannot tolerate silence for longer than a few minutes. Not because they find it boring, but because they find it honest. Silence has no agenda. It does not flatter you. It does not distract you. It simply shows you what is actually there. And what is actually there, when you are finally willing to look without flinching, is almost always more manageable than the noise made it seem. Epictetus taught that the first step toward wisdom is knowing what you do not know. The first step toward a new story is hearing the old one clearly enough to recognize it as a story. And you cannot hear it clearly while the noise is running. The noise is, in many cases, a defense system your old story has erected to protect itself from examination. Turn the noise off. Not forever, not with rigid self-denial, but with intentionality, with the quiet daily choice to give the new story space to breathe before the world fills that space with its own demands. There is a particular kind of silence that becomes available after about 3 weeks of consistent practice. A silence that is not empty, but full. Full of your own thoughts, your own observations, your own instincts, rising without the interference of external voices drowning them out. People who establish this practice consistently report something that sounds almost paradoxical. The quieter their environment, the clearer their sense of direction. The less external input they consume, the more certain they become about what they actually want. This is not paradoxical. This is exactly what the Stoics predicted. The voice of reason, the voice of your highest self, the voice of the story you were always meant to be living is not loud. It never was. It has been there all along, speaking in a register just below the noise floor of modern life. Silence does not create that voice. It simply makes it finally audible. Your first act of rewriting is not to pick up a new pen. Your first act is to create enough quiet that you can hear what the new story has been trying to tell you all along. Chapter 5. The architecture of a new morning every story has a first line. The first line sets the tone for everything that follows. It establishes the emotional register, the pace, the quality of attention the reader is invited to bring. A first line written carelessly produces a story that never quite finds its footing. A first line written with intention creates a gravity that pulls everything else into alignment. The first hour of your morning is the first line of your day. And most people, without realizing it, are opening every single day with the same first line. Reach for the phone. Flood the mind with information before a single original thought has had the chance to surface. Begin the day already reacting, already behind, already inside someone else's narrative before you have even left your own bed. This is not a small thing. The neurological state you enter in the first 30 minutes of waking sets a biochemical and psychological tone that research consistently shows influences decision-making, emotional reactivity, and cognitive clarity for hours afterward. You are, in the most literal neurological sense, programming your operating system every morning. The question is simply whether you are doing it consciously or by default. The Stoics began their mornings with a practice called the morning meditation. Marcus Aurelius documents it with remarkable specificity in his private journals. Before the day began, before the court assembled, before the empire made its demands, he would spend time in quiet, deliberate reflection. He would remind himself of his values. He would anticipate the challenges ahead and prepare his responses in advance. He would return deliberately to the story of who he had decided to be. He did not wait to see what kind of person the day would make him. He decided in advance. This is the architecture your 90 days requires. Not a rigid routine enforced through willpower and abandoned by day 12, but a consistent, flexible, genuinely personal structure for the first part of your morning that serves one single purpose. Reminding yourself, before the world gets a vote, who you are choosing to be today. What this looks like will be different for every person. For some, it will be 5 minutes of complete stillness before anything else. For some, it will be writing, not journaling in the traditional sense of recording events, but the Stoic practice of writing as thinking. Putting the new story into words on a page, not to share with anyone, not to perform, but to make it real enough to carry into the day. For some, it will be a single question asked in silence before rising. The Stoics were particularly fond of this practice. Marcus Aurelius asked himself each morning, "What do I still lack in order to achieve freedom from passion?" Seneca asked, "What weakness of mine did I overcome yesterday?" You might ask something simpler, something more immediate. What story am I choosing to live today? The answer does not need to be elaborate. It does not need to be inspiring. It simply needs to be yours. Chosen deliberately, held lightly, returned to across the hours of the day whenever the old story attempts to reassert itself. The morning is not about becoming a different person before breakfast. It is about setting a direction, pointing yourself quietly and with intention toward the person you are in the slow process of becoming. Giving that person enough of a running start that the old habits and old voices have slightly less purchase than they did yesterday. Slightly less is enough. Slightly less, accumulated across 90 mornings, is everything. Seneca wrote, "Begin at once to live and count each separate day as a separate life." Each morning of your 90 days is a separate life, a fresh first line, a new opportunity to open the story differently than you opened it yesterday. The architecture does not need to be grand, it simply needs to be intentional, and it needs to be yours. Chapter 6, Grief and the Old Self. Nobody talks about this part. Every conversation about personal change focuses on the gaining, the new habits you will build, the new clarity you will find, the new version of yourself that is waiting, just 90 days ahead, patient and fully formed, ready to step into when you arrive. Nobody talks about what you have to leave behind to get there, because transformation is not only an arrival, it is also a departure. And departures, even from places that were not good for you, even from identities that were limiting and painful and small, carry a grief that is entirely real and almost entirely unacknowledged. You are going to mourn the old story. This is not a sign that you are doing it wrong. This is a sign that you are doing it honestly. The old story, however much it hurt you, was also familiar. And familiarity for human beings operates with an almost gravitational pull. We are creatures built for pattern recognition and threat avoidance, and the brain has a deeply embedded preference for the known over the unknown, even when the known is painful and the unknown holds every possibility of relief. This is why people return to relationships that diminish them, why they stay in careers that suffocate them, why they abandon new beginnings in the first weeks, not because the new beginning is not better, but because the old familiar discomfort feels safer than the unfamiliar possibility of something good. Marcus Aurelius understood this pull. He wrote, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it?" And it is equally true of the grief of self-transformation. The grief of leaving the old story feels, in the moment, more significant than the liberation waiting on the other side of it. But this is always the distortion of proximity. What is close always feels larger than what is distant, even when the distant thing is the one that will ultimately define you. The grief comes in specific forms. You may notice it as a strange wistfulness for the version of yourself that did not know better, that had not yet begun this work, that could still live inside the old story without the uncomfortable awareness that it was a story. Ignorance is a kind of comfort, and awareness removes it permanently. You may feel it as a reluctance to fully commit to the new story, because commitment to the new requires a final release of the old, and part of you is still holding on. Still offering the old identity one more chance to prove it has something to offer. Still entertaining the possibility that the familiar, however painful, might yet turn out to be the safer choice. You may feel it in your relationships as you notice that some of the people closest to you are more comfortable with the old version of you than with the new one. That your change creates a dissonance in the dynamic, and part of you wants to soften the transition for them by not fully making it yourself. All of this is grief, and all of it is normal. Epictetus wrote, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." This is not passive acceptance. This is the active, courageous, deeply demanding practice of allowing reality to be what it is, including the reality of your own grief, without being controlled by it. You can grieve the old story without returning to it. You can feel the pull of the familiar without following it. You can mourn what is ending while still continuing to walk toward what is beginning. Give yourself permission to feel this. The grief of the old self is not weakness. It is the evidence that the change you are making is real. Surface-level changes produce no grief because they disturb nothing deep enough to matter. The grief is the depth marker. It tells you that something genuine is shifting. And it will pass. Not all at once, not by a predetermined day on the calendar, but slowly, quietly, in the way that all genuine grief resolves, not by disappearing entirely, but by integrating, becoming part of the story rather than an obstacle to it. You are not betraying the person you were by becoming someone different. You are honoring them. You are taking everything they survived, everything they learned in the difficult years of living inside the old story, and carrying it forward into something that finally has room for all of it. That is not loss. That is the most faithful possible act of continuation. Chapter 7. The people who prefer your old story there is a particular kind of resistance that no one warns you about when you begin to change. It does not come from strangers. It does not come from the world at large, which is largely indifferent to your transformation either way. It comes from the people who know you, the people who love you. The people who have built their understanding of who you are around the version of you that existed before you decided to rewrite the story. And when you begin to change, something happens in those relationships that is uncomfortable and real and almost never discussed. They push back. Not always consciously, not always unkindly. But the pushback is there, in the small comments that seem designed to return you to the familiar, in the jokes about how long this new phase will last, in the quiet withdrawal of enthusiasm when you talk about the changes you are making, in the moments where someone who loves you genuinely, someone who wants the best for you in every other context, seems inexplicably more comfortable when you are struggling than when you are succeeding. This is not malice. It is almost never malice. It is something more human and more complicated than that. When you change, you implicitly disturb the equilibrium of every relationship you are part of. You create a new version of yourself that the people around you have not yet learned how to relate to. And for some of them, the discomfort of that adjustment is significant enough that they will, without fully realizing what they are doing, apply gentle but consistent pressure to return you to the version of yourself they already know. Seneca observed this with characteristic directness. He wrote, "Associate with those who are likely to improve you. Welcome those who you are capable of improving." The process is mutual. The people who prefer your old story are not your enemies. But they are also, for the duration of these 90 days, not your allies in the specific work of becoming. They occupy a middle space that requires from you a particular kind of maturity. The maturity to love them without being governed by them, to remain warm and present in the relationship while not allowing the relationship to become a reason to slow down or stop. This is harder than it sounds because the pull of belonging is among the most powerful forces in human psychology. We are social creatures wired for group membership, and the threat of disapproval, even gentle disapproval, even disapproval disguised as affectionate teasing, activates the same neural alarm systems as physical threat. Your nervous system does not cleanly distinguish between social exclusion and danger. It simply registers threat and floods you with the impulse to do whatever is necessary to restore the sense of safety. For most people, the path back to safety is the path back to the old story, to the familiar version of themselves that the group already accepts. Your 90 days asks you to find a different kind of safety, one that does not depend on the approval of those who preferred you smaller. Marcus Aurelius put it this way: "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect." The word you have made for these 90 days is to yourself, to the person you are in the process of becoming. And breaking that word, returning to the old story because the people around you find it more comfortable, is a cost that will outlast the temporary relief of restored approval. This does not mean isolation. This does not mean severing relationships or surrounding yourself only with people who celebrate every step of your transformation. Real relationships contain friction. Real love sometimes pushes back in the wrong direction for the right reasons. But it does mean becoming very clear about whose voice gets a vote in the direction of your becoming. And it means understanding, with compassion for everyone involved, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a relationship is to demonstrate, through consistent and undefended change, that the new version of you is still worthy of it. Most relationships expand to accommodate genuine growth. Some do not. That information, however painful, is also part of the story you are writing. The people who are meant to walk with you into the next chapter will find their way there. Trust the process enough to keep walking. Chapter 8. Discipline as an act of self-love. We have been taught to think about discipline in entirely the wrong way. Discipline, in the cultural imagination, is a form of self-punishment. It is the cold shower taken through gritted teeth, the meal foregone out of guilt, the alarm obeyed not because you want to rise, but because some harsh inner authority demands that you do. Discipline, in this telling, is what you inflict upon yourself when you have decided that the natural version of you is not acceptable. This is not discipline. This is self-contempt wearing the costume of self-improvement. Real discipline The kind that the Stoics practiced and described and built entire philosophical systems around, is something entirely different. It is the most profound and consistent act of self-love available to a human being. Think about what discipline actually does when it is practiced from the right place. It creates the conditions in which your highest values can actually be expressed. It removes the gap between who you say you are and how you actually live. It builds day by day and choice by choice the one thing that self-esteem is actually constructed from, which is not how other people see you, not how you feel about yourself on good days, but the evidence accumulated through your own consistent actions that you can be trusted by yourself. That is the core of it. Discipline is the practice of becoming someone you can trust. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." The present is where discipline lives. Not in the grand future vision of who you will eventually become, but in the small, immediate, daily choice in front of you right now. The choice to read instead of scroll. The choice to sleep instead of numb. The choice to sit with discomfort instead of reaching immediately for relief. Each of those choices is not a sacrifice. Each of those choices is a vote. A quiet, private vote for the new story over the old one. Neuroscience has given us a framework for understanding why this matters at the biological level. Every time you make a choice that is consistent with your stated values, the neural pathway associated with that choice is slightly strengthened. Every time you override a habitual response in favor of a deliberate one, the automatic pull of the old habit is slightly weakened. This is not metaphor. This is literal neural architecture being reshaped through the accumulation of daily choices. What this means practically is that discipline becomes easier over time. Not because you develop some superhuman tolerance for difficulty, but because the new behavior gradually stops being a choice that requires effort and begins to feel like an expression of who you naturally are. This is the transformation that 90 days is long enough to begin experiencing. The moment when the new story stops being something you are trying to live and starts being something you simply live. Epictetus was characteristically direct about this. He wrote, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And the mastery he described was never about domination or suppression of the self. It was about alignment, the freedom that comes from living in consistent harmony with your own deepest values, rather than being perpetually pulled between what you believe and how you behave. That alignment is what discipline, practiced from a place of self-love rather than self-contempt, ultimately produces. It also produces something that is harder to name but immediately recognizable when you encounter it in other people. A kind of settled quality, a groundedness that does not shift with every change in circumstance or every swing of mood. The unshakable calm of someone who knows, from the evidence of their own daily choices, that they can be trusted with their own life. That quality is not charisma. It is not confidence in the conventional sense. It is something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It is integrity. The lived experience of being whole, of having the outer life and the inner life finally telling the same story. Love yourself enough to be consistent. Love yourself enough to show up for the practice, even on the days when nothing in you wants to. Love yourself enough to build, through the slow accumulation of honored commitments, the one relationship that will determine the quality of every other relationship you will ever have. The relationship with yourself. the one the new story is entirely built on. Chapter 9. When you fall back into the old chapter, you will. This is not a warning. This is not a threat. It is simply the most honest and useful thing that can be said to someone in the middle of a genuine transformation. You will have days, possibly many days, scattered across these 90, where the old story reasserts itself with a force that feels absolute, where every choice you made in the direction of the new feels suddenly and completely as though it belonged to someone else, where the familiar patterns flood back not gradually but all at once, and you find yourself behaving, thinking, reacting in precisely the ways you thought you had moved beyond. And in that moment, the most dangerous thing you can do is what most people do. Conclude that the fall means the transformation was never real. It does not mean that. It has never meant that. The fall is not the opposite of transformation. The fall is part of it. It is one of the most consistent and predictable features of any genuine identity-level change, and the people who understand this in advance are the ones who ultimately complete the journey. The people who do not understand it are the ones who abandon the path the moment the first fall arrives, convinced that their relapse into the old story is evidence that the new story was always a fantasy. Marcus Aurelius was not exempt from this. He wrote in his private journals about his own failures to live up to his philosophical commitments, about losing his temper when he had resolved to be patient, about falling into anxiety about outcomes beyond his control when he had trained himself toward equanimity. These were not the writings of a failed Stoic. They were the writings of a practicing one. Practice implies the possibility of imperfection. Practice implies that there will be sessions that go well and sessions that do not. Practice implies that the measure of commitment is not the absence of failure, but the consistency of return. Seneca wrote, "Begin again." That is the entirety of what is required when you fall back into the old chapter. Not an elaborate analysis of what went wrong, not a punishing reassessment of your worthiness to continue, not a revised timeline or a new and more detailed plan. Simply the quiet, non-negotiable decision to begin again. The Stoics had a concept called returning to the practice. It was built into their philosophical framework from the beginning because they understood, with a psychological sophistication that remains remarkable 2,000 years later, that human beings do not change linearly. Change moves in spirals. You return to the same territory repeatedly, but each time from a slightly different elevation, each time with slightly more understanding, each time with slightly less fear. The fall back into the old chapter is not regression. It is the spiral returning to familiar ground with more wisdom than it had last time. What matters in the moment of the fall is not the falling. It is what you say to yourself in the aftermath. The internal narrative that follows the relapse is often more consequential than the relapse itself. Because the most damaging thing about falling back into the old story is not the momentary return to old behavior. It is the story you tell about what that return means. If the story is, "I knew this would happen, I always do this, I am not the kind of person who changes," then the fall has successfully recruited you back into the old narrative. The fall has won. If the story is, "I fell, and I am returning to the practice," then the fall has done nothing except confirm that you are a human being engaged in the difficult and non-linear work of genuine transformation. You are allowed to fall. You are allowed to have bad days and bad weeks. You are allowed to lose the thread and need to find it again. What you are not allowed to do, if you are serious about these 90 days, is use the fall as a reason to stop. Begin again, as many times as the 90 days requires. Each beginning is not a sign of weakness. Each beginning is an act of profound, quiet, unwitnessed courage. And it is in the accumulation of those quiet acts of courage, more than in the impressive days when everything flows easily and the new story feels natural, that the transformation actually takes root. The person you are becoming is not the one who never falls. It is the one who always returns. Chapter 10. The quiet power of becoming unrecognizable. Real transformation does not announce itself. This is one of the most counterintuitive truths of genuine personal change, particularly in a cultural moment that has made transformation into a content genre. Where before and after photographs stand in for inner depth. Where the public declaration of a new beginning is treated as equivalent to the new beginning itself, where the performance of change has become so normalized that most people have confused it with the actual thing. The quiet transformations, the ones that happen in private, accumulated across unglamorous ordinary days, without audience or documentation, without the social validation of visible progress, are almost always the most complete, the most permanent, the most real. The Stoics were deeply suspicious of performed virtue. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, in the pages of a journal he never shared, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." The instruction is not, tell people you are becoming one. It is not, document the becoming for others to witness and affirm. It is simply, uncomplicatedly, be one. The becoming is private. The being is what others eventually encounter. There is a particular kind of power that develops in people who change quietly. People who, over the course of months or years of private practice, become genuinely different in ways that were never announced or explained. People who simply one day respond to something differently than they used to, who no longer need the approval they once chased, who are no longer wounded by the criticisms that once devastated them, who have, without fanfare, built an interior life stable enough to hold them through whatever the exterior world delivers. Other people notice this kind of person, not always immediately, not always consciously, but the quality of quiet, unforced, unperformed solidity draws attention precisely because it is so rare and so recognizable when you encounter it. Epictetus described this quality in people who are genuinely committed to philosophical practice. He said they become like someone who has trained extensively and then simply lives from that training. Without reference to it, without performance of it, the training becomes invisible because it has become natural. This is what unrecognizable looks like in practice. Not a dramatic unveiling, not a moment of triumphant revelation, just the slow, accumulating reality that the person you are now does not respond to life the way the person you were used to. You are no longer triggered by the same things, not because you have suppressed the trigger, but because the underlying wound that made it a trigger has been genuinely addressed. You are no longer seeking the same validations. Not because you have trained yourself to pretend you do not need them, but because the new story provides an internal stability that makes external approval feel optional rather than essential. You are no longer telling yourself the same stories about what you deserve and what is possible for you. Not because you have been persuaded by affirmations, but because 90 days of consistent different choices have built actual evidence for a different narrative. This is what transformation looks like when it is real. It is quiet. It is internal. It is often only fully visible in retrospect, when you look back from a distance and realize that the person you were at the beginning of these 90 days and the person you are now are genuinely, not performatively, different. And the people around you will notice. Not necessarily with words, not necessarily with the recognition you might have hoped for, but in the subtle shift in how they relate to you. In the different quality of the room when you enter it. In the conversations that are available to you now that were not available to the previous version of you. Becoming unrecognizable is not about leaving people behind. It is about growing into a version of yourself that has more to offer every relationship you value. More patience, more genuine presence, more capacity to give without needing to take, more ability to hold space for others because your own interior space is finally genuinely held. The quiet ones change the most. And the most quietly changed people carry something that no performance of transformation ever produces. They carry peace. Earned, private, unshakable peace. The kind that comes from knowing, not from being told, not from being affirmed, but from the evidence of your own 90 days that you kept the promise to yourself. Chapter 11. Writing the final page who you are on day 91, is not an ending. Let that land fully before we continue, because there is a particular kind of disappointment that waits for people who treat a 90-day commitment as a destination rather than a departure point, who arrive at the other side of the practice expecting to feel finished. Expecting the transformation to feel complete, expecting perhaps that the work will be done and they can finally rest in the person they have become without the ongoing effort of becoming. Day 91 is the first page of the rest of the story, written, finally, by you. But it is worth pausing here, on the threshold of that day, to truly consider who you are in it. Not the idealized future self of the early days, the projection made in optimism before the work had truly begun. But the actual, real, specific person who made it through 90 days of quiet, consistent practice. Who fell and returned, who grieved and continued. Who chose, imperfectly and persistently, the new story over the old one across the full, unglamorous length of this commitment. That person is not who you were on day one. The change may not be visible in the ways you imagined. The dramatic external transformation that self-improvement culture promises is rarely how genuine change actually presents itself. What is different on day 91 is something quieter and more consequential than anything external. You have evidence now, the most powerful substance known to the human psyche when it comes to the question of identity. You have 90 days of proof, drawn from your own lived experience, that you are capable of choosing differently. Of showing up for yourself, of holding a commitment through difficulty and doubt and the pull of the familiar and the grief of the old self and the resistance of the people around you and the falls and the returns and all of it. That evidence changes everything. Marcus Aurelius wrote near the end of his meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." He returned to this truth repeatedly, not because he had forgotten it, but because the practice of returning to it was itself the point. Day 91 is your version of that return. A return to the fundamental truth that you are not the story you inherited. You are the person who decided to write a different one. Seneca said, "It is not that I am brave. It is that I know what deserves to be feared. And by the time you reach day 91, you will know something similar about the old story. Not that it is not powerful, not that it will never rise again, but that you have faced it, worked with it, moved through it, and come out the other side with something it never prepared you for. The capacity to keep going anyway. The person you are on day 91 is someone who knows that. Knows it not theoretically, not philosophically, not from having read about it in someone else's words, but from having lived it inside their own story across 90 real days. Who are you in that knowing? You are someone who no longer needs the old story to feel safe, because you have built, through practice, a new interior structure that provides safety without requiring you to stay small. You are someone who can sit with discomfort without being destroyed by it, who can feel grief without becoming it, who can be challenged, criticized, misunderstood, without immediately reaching for the narrative that confirms your oldest fears. You are, in the most literal possible sense, the author of your own life now. Not because the external circumstances have all been resolved, not because every relationship has healed and every old wound has closed and every obstacle has been cleared. The world is exactly as complicated on day 91 as it was on day 1. What is different is the person inside it. Epictetus said, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." Day 91 is the day you understand, from the inside, what that actually means. Not as a philosophical position, but as a lived reality. You have spent 90 days making the best use of what was in your power. 90 days of returning to the only thing any human being has ever truly controlled, which is the story they choose to tell about who they are and what they are capable of. The final page of these 90 days is not the last page of the book. It is the first page of the only edition that has ever truly been yours. Write it well. Write it honestly. Write it with the calm authority of someone who knows, from evidence rather than hope, that they can. Soft closing you made it here, not to the end of something, to the beginning of something. And the distinction matters more than it might seem right now, in this moment of arriving. The 90 days you have just walked through were never about becoming a finished version of yourself. They were about something far more valuable than that. They were about discovering, through the only method that actually produces genuine knowing, which is the method of living it, that you are capable of holding a commitment to yourself across difficulty. That you are capable of meeting the old story with something other than belief. That you are capable, quietly and without applause and without the guarantee of anyone else's approval, of choosing differently. That is not a small thing. That is, in the truest sense, everything Marcus Aurelius, on the last pages of the private journals he kept through the most demanding years of his life, did not write in triumph. He did not record a moment of arrival or completion. He wrote with the same quiet intentionality he had brought to the very first page about the practice, about returning, about the daily, unheroic, essential commitment to living in accordance with his deepest values, regardless of how the world responded. He understood something that these 90 days have been quietly teaching you. There is no destination. There is only the practice, the daily, chosen, quietly radical practice of living as the author rather than the character, of meeting each new morning as a fresh first line, of returning with compassion and without drama whenever the old story tries to reclaim its pages. You are not the person who began this journey on day one. You have evidence of that now. Real evidence, drawn from your own lived experience, that the new story is not only possible but already, in these 90 days, already being written. Carry that evidence with you. Return to it on the hard days. Let it be the ground beneath you when the old familiar gravity tries to pull you back. And when you feel lost, which you will, because everyone does, return here. Return to the stillness, return to the practice, return to the quiet, unshakable truth that the story of your life is not something that happens to you. It is something you write. Every morning, every choice, every day. One quiet page at a time. And when you feel lost, which you will, because everyone does, return here. Return to the stillness. Return to the practice. Return to the quiet, unshakable truth that the story of your life is not something that happens to you. It is something you write. Every morning, every choice, every day, one quiet page at a time.